our new branch of Bilingualism Matters here. So I'm going to say a couple of things that are similar, but a couple of things that are different than I said yesterday. Antonella is professor of linguistics in the School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. What is really impressive about Antonella is that she is a person who really embodies the model of reinvention. Each of us, I think that those of you who are graduate students think, oh, I'm going to be just like my advisor, or maybe just opposite to my advisor, but you have an idea that you have a very clear idea of what it is you're going to be in your life. And I think that certainly in the generation that I went to graduate school, that was really the model. The model was you trained yourself to a particular area of research, to a particular set of methods and a particular kind of expertise, and that's who you were going to be. And in 2017, we're living at a very different time. And what becomes clear over time is that each of us has to be ready to reinvent ourselves, to really reinvent our theoretical commitments, our methodological expertise, our place in the world. Now, Antonella has made a fantastic contribution to the field, a very distinguished contribution to the field by engaging the public through Bilingualism Matters, and we really owe her a tremendous debt of gratitude for what she's done for all of us who work on this topic. But what she's also done that's really significant is that in all of the discussion, and certainly in her training sessions yesterday and some of what's been said today, there's a lot of discussion about the consequences of bilingualism across the lifespan and how we think about that. But if we take a very hard look, and there's a lot of debate in the literature and a lot of contentious debate in the literature, but if we take a hard look, what we see is very little of that debate is really about language. And part of the reason is very few of the people who are engaged in that discussion are linguists, and very little of that work really asks the question of how is it that language is being used that should have the consequences of bilingualism, where we might be able to really begin to dig in to understand what are the underlying mechanisms of the way language is used that might produce any of these remarkable consequences. And so in my view, this is my own particular take on Antonella's work, is that she has made a very special contribution by looking in a very sophisticated way at the way that the linguistics inform cognition. And it's a model for, I think, what much more work that needs to be done in this area, and one that needs to also inform the debates that are ongoing, where people are comparing bilinguals and monolinguals and really not paying much attention at all to the linguistics of it. And so we are thrilled today that she will give the keynote address at this conference on enhancing the scientific and public understanding of bilingualism. Please join me in welcoming Antonella.
Thank you so much. Let me just say that it's really great to be here, and this kind of conference is exactly what we're trying to achieve and what we should be doing more often. We should be coming together from different areas of expertise. We should talk to one another. We should compare our results and our findings. And to me, that's the only way we can really understand very complex phenomena like bilingualism. Having said that, this is the first talk in the afternoon, so I have the hard job to keep you awake, first of all, and also keep myself awake, because I'm 9 hours ahead in my head. So what I'd like to do, again, this is the point I was making. I regard myself as a bridge builder. I'm a linguist by training, but I'm really convinced that both the scientific understanding of bilingualism and the public understanding of bilingualism requires bridges. In one case, bridges across different fields, and in the other case, bridges between research and society. So that's what I've been trying to achieve with Bilingualism Matters in my public engagement work, but also, as I hope it will become clear, in my scientific work as well. And the 2 points that are the two halves of my talk will focus on slightly different things, and I hope I'll have time to really go to the second one. If not, we'll leave it aside. So first of all, I want to talk about an aspect of my work which I've been working on for some time, and that's the convergence between the first language and the second language in late bilinguals. And then, if there is time, I'd like to talk about the variability that we see in bilingualism with minority languages. And in both cases, I'll try to draw some implications for society, for the general audiences. So, convergence, why do we see it? Now, I think we all know, I hope, that your first language changes when you learn another language, okay? Maybe this is not obvious to many people. It should be obvious to us that this is a completely normal phenomenon. When two languages are in contact with one another, both in the same individual brain and in communities, they affect each other in both directions, not just in one direction. So for a long time, people studied second language acquisition only from the point of view of the effects of the first language onto the second. So, you know, transfer, cross-linguistic influence, but in one direction only. Now, we are beginning to understand that the phenomenon happens in the other direction. What I want to focus on is a very, very interesting phenomenon, which shows up in not just in my research, but now in other studies as well. And the fact that we see very similar patterns if we look at people who experience attrition in the first language and people who are very good learners or very good speakers of a second language. So we see convergence between these two populations. And we see convergence not across the board. This is a linguistically interesting point. We see convergence only in certain aspects of language. Those that involve complex contingencies, to borrow this term from Colin Phillips' work. And these are generalizations that involve the integration of information across multiple levels of encoding, particularly syntax and grammar and pragmatics. So that's the area where we find convergences, as well I'll show you in a minute, and that's the area I'm going to focus on. So the convergences mean that when we look at late bilingual speakers, I'm using the term bilingualism in a broad sense, so a late bilingual, somebody who learns another language as an adult and reaches a certain level of proficiency is a bilingual for me, and that should be clear. So what we see in late bilingual speakers of null subject languages are languages like Italian, my native language, where you can drop the subject pronoun, and Spanish is the same. They are the same type of language where you can omit the subject pronoun, but you can also use it. So you have a choice that, as we'll see, it's pragmatically conditioned. So we see the convergence is this. We see that both native speakers of Italian and Greek and Spanish and other languages of the same type who experience attrition and advanced non-native speakers of these languages, so non-native speakers of these languages, they all do one thing. They tend to extend the overt pronoun. Remember that these languages allow the choice between dropping the pronoun, so a null pronoun, and an overt pronoun, so realizing the pronoun explicitly. So they all tend to overextend the scope of the overt pronoun in context in which you would expect to find the a null. So you would expect not to see a pronoun there. But they do it in that direction. They don't do it in the other direction. So they don't overgeneralize null pronouns to the wrong context. So what do I mean? Let's show some examples. So preferences of monolingual Italians, and I've added probabilistic because we're not talking about strong ungrammaticality, right? We're talking about preferences for interpreting the pronoun in a particular way instead of another way. But these preferences are probabilistic in the sense that they admit exceptions. So if a monolingual speaker sees a sentence like that says, Paola ha salutato sua madre quando è uscita. Paola greeted her mother when null went out. So the preferred interpretation of that null pronoun is that it refers to the subject. It refers to Paola. So who's gone out? Paola, rather than her mother. Although, there are people who might interpret that pronoun as referring to her mother, but we're talking about preferences, remember. If they see the same sentence with an overt pronoun, so Paola ha salutato sua madre quando lei è uscita, when she, overt, went out, this time the preferred interpretation is that the overt pronoun refers to the non-subject, so the object referent in that sentence, okay? So, division of labor, again, probabilistic preferences. What happens to bilinguals? What happens to bilinguals is that for the overt pronoun, the bilingual speaker may accept the same interpretation or use the pronoun in a consistent way to the monolingual preferences, but they also go for this overextension, so the overt pronoun refers to the subject. So there is ambiguity there. There is a variability in that interpretation. For the null pronoun, no difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. So same sentence with the null pronoun, both bilinguals and monolinguals prefer the interpretation where the null refers to the subject. So that's the phenomenon that I'm talking about, and we see these effects both in the native language of native speakers of these languages who are experiencing attrition, and in the same languages spoken as second languages by non-native speakers, okay? Right, so why do we see these effects? Now, I'm going to show you three possibilities, and my point is going to be, it's very difficult to choose only one, and that's why we need interdisciplinarity. These explanations are not mutually exclusive, and we shouldn't make the mistake of going only for one, because that's only one explanation possible. So the first explanation that we took when we started doing this job is probably the most obvious one. So these bilinguals have another language by definition, right? So it's the other language that is influencing the null subject language. In most of the early studies that people did, including ourselves, the other language was English. So English doesn't really allow a free choice of null versus overt, although in some context you can drop a pronoun in English, but in a much more restricted set of circumstances. So that's the explanation for you, right? It's a fairly obvious one. It's English that influences the other language. So in one case, these preferences are not completely acquired in Italian, say, as a second language, because there is a continuing effect of English as the other language. In the case of attrition, because English is the second language, the language that is influencing the first, then the English system is affecting the preferences, in the system of the first language. So transfer effects, right? But this can't be the whole story, because we've known for some time that the same phenomenon is observed in bilingual speakers of two null subject languages of the same type. So where English is not involved. So this is not a complete exhaustive list of studies that have found this overextension of overt pronouns. So, you know, you see Spanish, Italian, Greek, Spanish, Catalan, Sardinian, and so on. So all of these are languages that allow the omission of pronouns, just like Italian. So it can't really be easily explained as a transfer effect, right? Not as easily as with English, of course. So the second account that we can entertain is that this phenomenon is not really due to transfer, or not only to transfer, but it must be due to being bilingual, with the fact of having more than one language. In what way? So what we're saying here is that it's the processing of the language that is affected, and what is affected specifically is the integration of grammatical and pragmatic information in real time. So that diagram is an oversimplification of what happens when you process pronouns. So you have a grammar that allows you to drop or not, but you also, you know, the conditions on whether you drop or not, whether you omit the pronoun or not, are not grammatical conditions. They're actually extra-linguistic. They're pragmatic conditions. They are contextual conditions. And so you have to be able to quickly relate your choice of pronouns to a particular context. And this choice is not given once for all. It has to be renewed all the time in real communication. In real context, you have to do that quick assessment of the context, of the knowledge shared between you and your listener, if you're producing, or vice versa. So the hypothesis is that it's this type of operations that are necessary when you process pronouns that is affected by that is affected by attrition, or that presents remaining variability in acquisition. So the locus of convergence that I was talking about. So if that's the case, the hypothesis is that grammar itself is not really affected. So your grammatical representations are not affected. What is affected is, you know, the processing strategies that are necessary to use pronouns in an appropriate way in a particular context. And in fact, we have some recent evidence that the grammar itself can't be affected in attrition, for example, because we did a study on re-exposure. So these were native speakers of Spanish who had been resident in the UK for a long time, so exposed to English and, you know, very good English for a long time. And we tested them on their subject pronoun preferences, and sure enough, we found a consistent pattern to what I described, so an overgeneralization of the overt subject. But then we tested a subset of these speakers right after they had been to Spain for 1 or 2 weeks in a completely monolingual environment where they only used and listened to Spanish and they didn't use English at all. So re-exposure in a monolingual environment, to Spanish in a monolingual environment. And what we found when we tested them as soon as they came back, well, not as soon as they stepped off the plane, but, you know, soon enough after they came back, is that their preferences for pronouns had partly reversed to monolingual values that we measured in monolingual Spain and monolingual speakers in Spain. So that short re-exposure had the effect of changing these preferences in the direction of the monolingual preferences. So if these preferences, if these phenomena are sensitive to re-exposure, we can't really say that it's the grammar that has changed. So what has changed, what is affected is these processing preferences that are sensitive to frequency of use or frequency of exposure determined by whether you are in a Spanish-speaking environment, for example, or not. So if it's a cognitive issue now and not a linguistic issue, then we want to consider, for example, the aspects of cognitive control that are involved in using these forms, these pronominal forms. So every time you use a pronoun, or you listen to, or you interpret a pronoun, you have to be able to, first of all, inhibit the irrelevant mappings. Remember that there are two choices, for example, in those sentences that I showed you. Either the pronoun refers to the subject or to the non-subject. If you go for one mapping, the other one doesn't apply, so you have to exclude it. As I said, you have to integrate rapidly changing information, so your choices are not once for all. You have to be able to update them in an efficient way, changing information from the context, assessment of the interlocutor's knowledge state. And you have to update your discourse model. So some of you may see some aspects of executive functions there that may be involved, particularly in these in this kind of structures that depend, as I said, on the integration of grammatical information and pragmatic information. So if that's the case, a straightforward hypothesis might be that bilinguals are not consistent at doing these operations, these processing mappings, because they don't always have sufficient cognitive resources. Okay, so it might be that the resources that are necessary to do that rapid inhibition, integration of changing information, updating of discourse model are in a sense drawn from the same pool of resources that is necessary to keep the two languages apart. And we know that bilinguals have to invest cognitive resources in keeping the two languages separate, particularly in excluding the language that they're not using. So if it's the same pool of attentional resources, one simple explanation is that they don't always have the necessary cognitive resources to do this kind of integration operations. So, it's essentially a deficiency due to not constantly available cognitive resources. An alternative hypothesis that is slightly more interesting, perhaps, is that the locus of the problem is actually the integration, specifically the action of integrating contextual and pragmatic information. So if that's the problem, then one interesting hypothesis is that there might be a trade-off between ability to inhibit, so inhibitory control, and ability to integrate. Now, I'm not making this up because psychologists have been working on this, and this kind of trade-off effects are well documented. What I'm hypothesizing is that it's particularly, these bilinguals that because they have to inhibit, one of their languages, in particular their dominant language, all the time, they might actually, their integration abilities might suffer inconsistently as a result. So the better you are at inhibiting, the worse you are, that's a simplification, the worse you are at integrating. If you are inhibiting, you are splitting, you're focusing on this and ignoring that. If you're integrating, in a sense, you're doing the opposite. You're pulling things together, you're trying to build coherence among different factors. So what if there is a trade-off of that kind? And this is consistent with the fact that what we see in this phenomenon is inconsistency, is variability. We don't see that bilinguals consistently overgeneralize the overt pronoun. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So this is consistent with the idea that it's due to fluctuations in the in cognitive resources available. If that's the case, we can make interesting predictions. So we can predict that there is a difference between early and late bilinguals. So we may predict that if you're an early bilingual, you may still have that trade-off effect, but you might be better at modulating your attentional control, your cognitive control, in a situation of unpredictability, like the contextual context in which we use pronouns. So if you're better at modulating attentional control, you may be less likely to suffer the effects of this trade-off situation. If you're a late bilingual, on the other hand, and so you haven't had, your lifetime experience of juggling the two languages, you develop very good inhibitory control because, in fact, you have a dominant language and you have to apply a lot of inhibition from the beginning, and for quite some time, and potentially all the time. So you develop a very, very good inhibitory control abilities at the expense of integration abilities. So you suffer the consequences of this trade-off effect more than an early bilingual. And so we see more of these effects in language, on language, in particular areas of language like pronominal use and pronominal interpretation that depend on integrating, quick integration of information. So less efficient integration, updating, modulation of attention in late bilinguals. Now, is that true? Let's start finding counter-evidence. That's what I love, I mean, you have to engage with counter-evidence. You have to, you make a hypothesis and then you see, well, is it consistent with what we see? Now, I'd like to give a couple of examples from sign language, and I'm sure that Karen may have something to say afterwards. So, evidence from sign language. This is very interesting because, in a sense, bimodal bilinguals in particular may not need to inhibit, to apply as much inhibitory control to the other language, because the two languages of bimodal bilinguals don't compete for the same articulatory channels. And so they can, and often are, produced at the same time. So there is less need to inhibit, right, one of the languages. Whereas unimodal signers, so people who use two sign languages, should have the same need to inhibit because the two languages compete for the same modality. So we would expect to find that this trade-off that affects pronominal interpretation is found particularly in unimodal bilinguals, in analogy with unimodal users of two spoken languages, but not in bimodal bilinguals. In fact, we find the same phenomenon in both populations. So we find that unimodal bilingual signers oversupply overt pronouns, and this is a recent study on unimodal bilingual signers of Emirati Sign Language and ASL. And we find that bimodal bilinguals, so Catalan speakers who learn Catalan Sign Language, both null subject languages, by the way, produce more redundant pronouns. So the prediction that the phenomenon is more prominent in unimodal bilinguals is not verified. At least we need more studies. Of course, we need more research. But if you look at this evidence, that is not it's not supported. So, and there are another piece of counter-evidence. Remember that I said, if that's the case, early bilinguals should do it less, because early bilinguals are better at modulating cognitive control. It's late bilinguals who are more, engaged in inhibitory control of their dominant language, and so, we would find these trade-off effects more in late bilinguals than in early bilinguals. A recent study by a student of mine looked at Sardinian Italian bilinguals. These are two null subject languages spoken in Sardinia, of course, second largest island of the Mediterranean. And Sardinia is a diglossic context. Sardinian is spoken mainly at home, and the Italian is spoken outside the home. And what my student found, she tested active Sardinian speakers, bilinguals, and passive Sardinian Italian bilinguals. She also had Italian monolinguals, so we're not going to say much about those. And she had a visual world eye tracking task, as well as a forced choice judgment task, so both online and offline evidence. And she found that Italian, Sardinian active bilinguals, sure enough, they overgeneralize. These are early bilinguals. These are early bilinguals of two similar languages. They also overgeneralize the overt pronoun, exactly like the late bilinguals that we were talking about. So they tended to look more at the subject antecedent in the visual world experiment with respect to the other group. And in contrast, the passive bilinguals didn't do that. So Italian, Sardinian passive bilinguals didn't really differ from Italian monolinguals. But the point is that these active bilinguals, that, early bilinguals, they've been using the two languages all their lives, they were predicted to be less likely to show this phenomenon. They show it anyway. So what we see, is an adaptive control system here, and that needs to be considered, and there's more than could be said about the difference between dual language context and single language context, like Sardinia, where the two languages are separate, as opposed to Catalonia, where the two languages are used in the same context. So we need to consider the type of bilingual experience. I haven't finished with the first phenomenon. A third account. Remember, let's recapitulate. First account, transfer from English. Second account, a trade-off between inhibition and integration. Now, let's have a look at the third account. What these bilinguals do, the result of this behavior that we find is over-explicitness. So overusing an overt pronoun means being redundant or being too explicit. Whereas think about what dropping pronouns all the time would mean. Dropping pronouns all the time, so overusing null pronouns would result in massive ambiguity, right? But this is not what happens. That doesn't happen. What happens is over-explicitness. So what if these bilinguals do this overextension of the overt pronouns because they have a higher threshold for salience. So, when you use a pronoun, you drop it if you realize that what you're talking about is salient enough in context so that, your listener, your interlocutor can also access it. So salience in context is something that determines whether you decide to drop a pronoun or not. What if these bilinguals actually have a higher threshold for deciding whether something is enough salient, and why? So they have a higher threshold for deciding when to drop a pronoun, and as a result, they drop fewer pronouns and they use more overt pronouns. Why would that be? Possibly because of an enhanced awareness of ambiguity, right? Being bilingual also means facing situations where, you're not clearly understood, or, you face misunderstanding, ambiguities of various kinds. So you may develop a higher sensitivity towards ambiguity. Another reason might be better perspective-taking abilities. This is another area of research that has shown a bilingual positive effect on the ability to take the other person's perspective. So what if the bilinguals use explicit forms more than they should because they are more aware of the potential for misunderstanding, and so they err on the side of being over explicit and redundant. So in production, of a pronoun, what we said at the beginning is that bilinguals might use this form, this redundant form, the overt pronoun, as a default, as a least effort strategy when they don't have enough cognitive resources, or when they can't really integrate contextual information very, very efficiently. But what I'm suggesting now is that they may do, not because they have a deficiency, but because they have a higher sensitivity to the hearer's perspective. So as I said, a higher threshold for salience in production. What about comprehension of pronouns? So the old story, the first story I presented, bilinguals may be over explicit in interpretation because they miss a cue that signals a shift in reference. So if your interlocutor uses an overt pronoun, it means that they are not referring to the most salient referent, they're actually shifting reference or referring to the less salient reference. So again, you know, this is a deficiency in a sense. They miss this cue and therefore they interpret the overt pronoun as if it's referring to the salient antecedent. But this new interpretation is that they do this because they attribute to the speaker the same over-explicitness and the same over-informativeness that characterizes their own production. So basically, they are attributing to the speaker the same strategies that they are using themselves. And so, yes, it is a change, you know, that we see in both the native language, in attrition, and in second language acquisition. So we see a convergence that may be due to these different factors. And as I said at the beginning, they're not necessarily exclusive, mutually exclusive, because they may actually be partly cumulative with one another. So a working hypothesis that we're making and that I mentioned yesterday is that successful second language learning might actually rely on a greater openness of the first language to change. So successful but late bilingualism might actually require some kind of reconfiguration of the cognitive network that serves both linguistic processing and non-linguistic processing, and therefore we see a convergence in these particular areas of language. And that means convergence between L1 and L2. We're talking about two different populations at the moment. The next step, we're about to embark in studying the same individuals, what happens in the L1 and the L2 within the same speakers rather than in different populations of speakers that I was talking about before. But the essence is that proficient late bilinguals are not like monolinguals in either language. And again, that's a completely predictable and normal phenomenon. How much time do I have? Okay, so let's move on to, just for, a little change, variability, and we can come back, to this part at the end. So we've been studying minority languages as well as other cases of bilingualism, and one of the conclusions that we can draw from research on bilingualism, which is also very relevant for people, for society, is that any language, bilingualism in any language is a good thing. So we know that there are, there is a prestigious kind of bilingualism, a less prestigious kind of bilingualism, and people have different attitudes towards different languages. But we also know that from the point of view of the brain, that doesn't matter. From the point of view of the brain, what matters is having more than one language in the brain. Whatever these languages are, whether they're spoken by 3 people or by 3 billion people, that shouldn't matter. So that means that for minority languages, those languages are potentially resources and opportunities that people should keep and value and invest in, rather than problems as they're often perceived. And speaking the minority language may give children the benefits of bilingualism. That's all very well, but is this true? We need the evidence, and we need to do research on these languages. So what we see, and research is not, there isn't a massive amount of studies on minority languages. So what we see is a rather mixed picture. And I mentioned some of these yesterday. So what we see, for example, is that in some communities, there are official bilingual communities, like the Basque Country and Wales. Some studies haven't found an advantage in bilinguals, an advantage for executive functions. Remember that, as many speakers before me have reminded us, there is a controversy out there, but particularly on research on executive functions. Not so much on research on the many other aspects of bilingualism that have been found to be positively influenced by the bilingual experience. But for this, there is a controversy out there. So in these cases, for example, studies haven't found a difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. Remember, they didn't find the disadvantage of bilinguals, but they did find an advantage either. And these are bilingual communities. So at first sight, you may wonder, why? I mean, this is precisely where you would expect a bilingual advantage, wouldn't you? In contrast, in Catalonia, many studies, particularly, the first wave of studies on executive functions did find a positive effect of the bilingual experience. This is another official bilingual community, right? Just like the others. So we don't find an effect in one or in two, we find an effect in the third. Cypriot Greek and Standard Greek, both spoken in Cyprus. These speakers have been studied, tests of executive function and others as well, pragmatic comprehension, and so-called bilectal or bidialectal, as I would say. Children show cognitive control advantages in this case, okay? Sardinian, we did study Sardinian bilingual children. And we studied younger bilingual children and older bilingual children in elementary schools in Sardinia, and we compared them with monolingual Italian children in the same area, so the same school and the same social class. What we found was that the effect was there, a positive effect of bilingualism was there, particularly in the older children. So it took a while to emerge. It didn't emerge in the younger children, but it did emerge in the older children. And we also tested Italian comprehension with standardized tests, because everybody in Sardinia thinks that if you speak Sardinian, you can't speak Italian very well. So we wanted to show that whether that's true or not, and guess what? It's not true. But if somebody bothers to check these effects, you realize that this is a myth. Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, we do a lot of work on Scottish Gaelic in Scotland because it's a minority language. It's not the only one, but it's the only fully supported one. And we tested bilingual children in Gaelic medium education. So unlike Sardinia, these children can go to schools that are where everything is entirely taught in Gaelic, all subject matters. And we compared them with students in English medium schools, the vast majority, and we gave them cognitive executive function tests, and we found a positive effect in 1 out of 3. So in the other 2, no difference. In the third, a difference. So again, if there is a difference, it goes in favor of the bilinguals, but it's not across the board. I examined a successful dissertation just 4 days ago, in the Netherlands, and this was about Frisian Dutch bilingualism, these were balanced Frisian Dutch bilinguals, and they found positive effects of bilingualism only on selective attention tasks, but not in interference suppression tasks. So in a subset of tasks that they used, not across the board again, but a positive effect was found, no difference in the others, so no disadvantage. So a very varied picture, and one possibility that we can ask is whether what needs to be taken into account in research is the patterns of bilingual use, for example. So again, this difference between dual language context, where both languages are heard in all contexts, basically, and single language context, where the two languages are separated, and so only one is used in some context and only the other one is used in other contexts. Well, what does that tell us? Well, it doesn't really give us a completely clear picture, because in dual language context, like Welsh English, the effect wasn't found, Basque Spanish, the effect wasn't found, but it was found in Catalan Spanish. Single language context, Sardinian Italian, the effect was found. Cypriot Greek, Standard Greek, the effect was found. Gallic English, the effect was found. Again, not across the board, but there was some evidence of the effect. Frisian Dutch, the effect was found. So it seems that, single language context might favor the emergence of these benefits compared to dual language context, but it's not very clear. We need more research. And there's also, and this is, I thank Judy for the suggestion, and I think this is a very interesting avenue to explore, the fact that, we should also consider the monolinguals living in these contexts, because monolinguals living in bilingual communities are possibly not like monolinguals living in monolingual countries or communities, because they tend to be exposed to the other language, even if they're not fluent speakers of that language, but they are exposed to the other language all the time. So the question is whether we can still regard them as full monolinguals, and whether we should expect to find a difference between them and the bilinguals. So maybe the fact that we don't find a difference in these bilingual communities may be due to the fact that monolinguals are not really monolinguals. And that raises the more general issue in research that, where are the monolinguals in many cases? We tend to assume them as a point of reference, but, where are the monolinguals? In a way, it's good that more and more young people are not monolingual, right? Even in traditionally monolingual countries like the one where I live, Britain, there's more and more young people who, have some awareness that there are other languages. They start languages in primary school. And so, we should perhaps, forget the idea of a comparison with the monolingual. Also, going back to the first point I made, the first point is that if you're bilingual, you're not like monolinguals. So you shouldn't expect to find similarities between bilinguals and monolinguals, because being bilingual, even late bilingual, actually changes your native language. So there are lots of good reasons to rethink the common practice of comparing bilinguals with monolinguals. So my general conclusion is that variability is great. Variability is exciting. Variability is something that we should embrace rather than being afraid of it, rather than, sweeping it under the carpet and saying, oh, this is not good. This is really something that contradicts, what we were thinking. We should be trying to understand variability better. It should be an incentive to do more research about the various factors that can influence bilingualism. And that's why, we need a lot more work and bridges across language and other cognitive domains, between different subfields of research on bilingualism and between research and society. And that's why we now have Bilingualism Matters that tries to do precisely this. So it builds, on interdisciplinary research, and that's essential, as I said, interdisciplinary research that brings together the insights from very different angles, and that's what we need. But also, it does a lot of work trying to bridge the gap between research and society. So I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about Bilingualism Matters because I did this yesterday, but we've been doing a lot of work for a number of years now. We're growing both in Scotland, where we are based, but also internationally, and now we're very happy to have a branch here that we opened yesterday, and I'm looking forward to a lot of very interesting collaborations, very interesting research collaborations, and exchanges of good practice for public engagement, for communicating research to the general public, and for benefiting and using that, the results of that public engagement to improve our own research. Thank you.
So I had a question about the sentence that you gave, where Paula greeted her mother when arrived or
Yeah.
when she arrived, right? One of the explanations of the three that you gave had to do with explicitness, that the intrusion of the pronoun or bringing in the pronoun when it's not, it wouldn't be appropriate for a monolingual to do so. It happens more with bilinguals for the purposes of explicitness, but I actually thought that might be counterintuitive given the fact that the presence of the pronoun versus the absence of the pronoun actually disambiguates the structure, right? When you don't have the pronoun, it's subject-oriented. And when you do have the pronoun, it's object-oriented. So once you actually start putting the pronoun in everywhere, that's when the ambiguity seems to arise, right?
In a sense, you're right. I mean, first of all, this division of labor between pronominal forms is not that neat, as I said before, right? It's not the case that, every time you have a null subject, the antecedent is a subject, and every time you have an overt subject, the antecedent is a non-subject, because there are exceptions, there is variation, and in fact, there is much more variation among monolinguals, even in our studies, when we had a monolingual control group, just, what I said we shouldn't be doing, but we are all sinners. You find that, the monolinguals are not that categorical, so it's a matter of preferences. But yeah, I mean, you can certainly construct laboratory sentences in which you create ambiguity, right, by using an overt pronoun when you shouldn't and things like that. In the vast majority of cases, however, using an overt pronoun creates redundancy rather than ambiguity. I mean, think of languages that don't allow dropping pronouns, right? I mean, you can use different ways and different strategies to clarify what you're talking about. You can use stress, you can use word order. So clearly, we're talking about some kind of simplification of the system, right? The fact that, the choice between pronominal forms is reduced, right? And there tends to be an overt pronominal that is overgeneralized, which, by the way, happens in other cases of language contact, right? Pigeons is a very good example, right? In pigeonization, even when the contact languages are null subject languages, it's the overt pronoun that emerges, right? It's the overt pronoun, and we have to ask why. We have to wonder, why don't people drop all the time? No, I mean, the null pronoun disappears essentially, and the overt pronoun is overgeneralized. So there are exceptions. Again, it's not a 50% a very clear system, but in general, we can say that it's a strategy that in the vast majority of cases creates redundancy, and it's over explicit rather than ambiguous. I think you need the.
Okay. We know that monolingual Italian-speaking children, even from some of your own work, go through a protracted period in which they overuse pronouns. So I'm trying to see how your three hypotheses might extend to this case. It's not the influence of English. It's not any cognitive kind of difficulty with managing two languages, and kids are not well known for trying to be overly explicit about anything. So anyway, my question is how do you extend this to the case of monolingual children acquiring null subject languages? I assume it happens in Spanish and other null. I know it happens in Italian.
Thank you, Nina, for the question. It's a very good question because yes, we did studies on older children, mind you, not very young. We compared school-aged children who had Italian and English or Italian and Spanish. And we found that in both cases, the overt pronoun was overgeneralized by the bilingual children. Now, the question is whether, the overgeneralizations that we see in children at that age has the same underlying reasons. Oh, well, you're talking about monolinguals. Okay. Monolingual Italian children, yes, even in our controls, they can, when they make a mistake, they tend to overgeneralize. So clearly, we can't automatically assume that we have the same reasons, for that kind of overgeneralization. But they do it a lot, more restrictedly than the bilinguals, for example. They do it anyway, so it needs to be explained, and we simply can't assume the same reasons, because in children there may be developmental reasons that are not the same as the reasons that I've just mentioned. So it's an open question. It's a good question. Thank you.
Hi, Antonella. Thank you so much for your approach. Actually, following on her accounts, it was really striking when we were showing all the data how actually the idea that there might be overgeneralization is also seen in aphasic speakers. So, that type of data, we have seen that a lot in object pronouns, but instead of dropping the pronoun because that might lead to difficulty, actually aphasic speakers overgeneralize and just produce a full NP again. Okay. And that is pragmatically incorrect.
Awkward, yes.
So the similarity between the pattern is very striking. Whether or not we can allot any of your explanations even to the aphasic phenomenon, that would be something really intriguing. But the similarity is very striking, and then it would be really nice to see the pattern.
So why do you think aphasic speakers go in the direction of over-explicitness rather than under-explicitness?
Right, in a way you propose that explanation. Yeah, exactly. I mean, in my dissertation data, it was very clear they had a lot of problems, but despite the problems, when they could, they actually would produce the full NP, which again, pragmatically in Italian is not correct, but that was pro-communication. So I think your hypothesis of, taking care of the hearer and the final communication approach is something that could explain a lot of also what aphasic speakers do.
Yes, I agree, and that's an interesting hypothesis to be pursued. So it might be that these speakers, precisely because they are aware of having a communicative problem,
right,
they overcompensate, by trying to be over-explicit in other areas as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. If you noticed any differences with the second language when the second language is linguistically much more different than the first language, like comparing like Italian speaker learning Spanish as opposed to Italian speaker learning like Chinese or Arabic. And so if those same kind of like results happen.
The answer is we don't know, and it would be very interesting to find out. I have plans to collaborate with some colleagues to work on bilingual Chinese-Italian speakers and see what happens. At the moment, we don't know. Very interesting question.
Thank you, Antonella, for that wonderful talk. If I could follow up on the conversation that started here about the use of these over pronouns and why people may do it. Although it may seem very intuitive that people might do this to help the hearer, there are recent theories of production that suggest that we are actually very selfish when we speak. And we speak to save, we speak to make things, whatever we do when we speak is to make things easier for us, not necessarily for the speaker. And I am aware that, of course, there are all these studies that look at alignment and so forth. But I wonder whether you might be able to think about the overuse of these pronouns more from the perspective of a production model, where people, once you use them and reuse them. So actually, not using them is difficult for the production system. Mm-hmm. So people think, well, you drop it, and so it should be easy because you don't have to pronounce it. But I wonder whether the explanation is simply an explanation that can derive from recent views on how production works, which of course is linked to comprehension, but whatever happens in production is motivated by principles to make, in general, production simpler, easier.
Simpler for the speaker.
For the speaker, yeah.
So
without-
this is a speaker
and great if we can help the listener, but it's more about, you know, what it is that our system needs to do, because we have a lot of pressure to produce and to produce fast. And, you know, a lot of things happen when people are producing, and so it could just be that people are using a principle of use and reuse. So once you've used an overpronoun, why not continue using the overpronoun? So using and reusing saves, I mean, this is just one idea, but I wonder if an explanation might be more a production-driven explanation and not a listener-driven explanation. And of course, I don't know the answer, but just something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's partly an open question, you know, whether using, what is easier from the point of view of the speaker, right? Because I suggested that the overt pronoun is a kind of a default form for the bilingual. Notice that, you know, linguistically, you know, the null pronoun is the default, and it's by far the most frequent pronoun in null subject languages and so on, compared to the overt pronoun. But from the point of view of the bilingual, you know, this might have a special status as a default form. Now, I'm not entirely clear or convinced that that you're always egocentric, and when you so there are other areas, you know. So you may be initially egocentric, but then, you know, quickly embrace the other person's perspective, and this is what happens in studies of perspective taking, for example, in adult bilinguals. So the idea is that, you know, you start from your own perspective, so, you know, that's automatic. You consider where you are and your own perspective, but then the difference between a bilingual and a monolingual is how quickly you embrace the other person's perspective. So, and this is nothing to do with language, you know, it's just perspective-taking research. So it might be that, yes, I mean, you know, there is a kind of default, you know, egocentrism in speakers, but, you know, bilinguals somehow are, you know, are quicker or more efficient at overcoming that, and that has linguistic consequences of this kind. But it's an open question. Thank you. Thank you.